Flight attendant kicks black cop off plane. She instantly regrets it. Please like and subscribe to follow interesting and meaningful stories. The morning had started like any other for Jake Harrison. Dressed in his sharp navy suit, his badge tucked away, he prepared for an important conference on police-community relations, a subject close to his heart. Officer Harrison wasn't just a decorated black police officer. He was a leader, a mentor, and someone who believed in bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community, especially with at-risk youth. As he made his way to the boarding gate, his thoughts were focused on his keynote speech. It was going to be an inspiring moment, the culmination of years of hard work. But life has a way of veering off course when we least expect it. At the gate, Monique stood, her face a mask of professional composure, though inside, the seams were fraying. This wasn't just any day. It was another endless shift after a week of dealing with rude passengers and nights spent alone in her small apartment, the silence a reminder of her recent divorce. Her savings were dwindling, her bills piling up. Her aging parents' medical needs loomed over her like a storm she couldn't outrun. Today, she wasn't just tired, she was at her breaking point. Jake stepped forward, handing Monique his boarding pass with a nod and a faint smile. It was automatic, his habit of being polite, even in the smallest of exchanges. But when Monique took the pass, something flickered behind her eyes. A hesitation, a tightening of her grip. Her gaze lingered too long, as if sizing him up, questioning his right to be there. Jake felt it immediately, the familiar, insidious sensation he had known all his life. He'd seen that look before. It was the quiet, subtle prejudice that didn't shout or scream, but whispered a message loud enough for him to hear. "You don't belong here." "There's an issue with your ticket," Monique said. Her voice clipped, a decision made in the split second between her fatigue and frustration. Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. There had been no issue at the check-in counter. The flight was critical, and he couldn't afford to miss it. For a moment, disbelief paralyzed him. But the whispers behind him from other passengers, the impatient huffing, the annoyed glances, spurred him into action. "Are you sure?" Jake asked, keeping his voice steady, calm. He had been in situations far more hostile than this and knew better than to react impulsively. Yet inside, something churned. This wasn't just a mistake. It felt intentional, as if she'd made a snap judgment, an assumption about who he was, or rather, who he wasn't. Monique's jaw tightened. She had already had enough complaints for one day. In her mind, this was just another obstacle, another complication in a life that seemed to be spiraling out of control. "Yes," she insisted, "you'll need to step aside." Jake took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could feel the eyes of the crowd burning into his back. He had a choice. He could challenge her right there, make a scene, demand an explanation, or he could walk away, get to the bottom of it, and deal with the problem in a measured way. He chose the latter. As he stepped away, the murmurs around him stung. He'd been here before, too many times. Always the one who had to prove himself, to explain his worth in a world that often saw him only as a black man in a white profession. His work with the youth, his mentorship program, the commendations, all of it felt distant in that moment, overshadowed by the cold truth of prejudice still lurking in places it shouldn't. At the security desk, the officer glanced at Jake's boarding pass, puzzled. "There's nothing wrong with this ticket," he said, looking up. "It's not flagged." Relief washed over Jake, followed swiftly by a deeper sense of anger. He had done everything right. He had followed the rules, earned his way, and yet here he was, denied, not because of a technical error, but because of someone else's snap judgment. Back at the gate, Monique stood, unaware of the storm brewing inside Jake or the impact of her decision. To her, it was just another routine day, another stress-filled moment where she had taken control of a situation the only way she knew how. But something inside her, a nagging discomfort, made her glance toward the security desk. She watched as Jake spoke with the guard, the frown on his face telling her all she needed to know. In that split second, Monique realized she had misjudged him. By the time Jake returned with the security officer, the air was thick with tension. The passengers watched, their curiosity barely masked. Monique's heart raced, and for the first time in a long time she felt the weight of her actions, not just as a professional, but as a person. "I'm sorry for the confusion," Monique said, her voice softer now, the words heavy with the realization of her mistake. Jake nodded, accepting the apology, but the damage was done. Both of them knew it. As he boarded the plane, the moment lingered between them like a shadow. But that wasn't the end. In the days that followed, Monique couldn't shake the encounter. It gnawed at her, forcing her to confront the biases she hadn't even known she carried. For Jake, the experience was another reminder of the long road ahead, but it also became a catalyst for change. He returned to his work with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to break down the walls that separated people, not just in the community, but in the everyday spaces where prejudice still lingered. Months later, their paths would cross again, under very different circumstances, and what had started as a moment of division would turn into an unexpected alliance. Both would learn that regret could be a powerful teacher, and forgiveness, when it came, could spark something even greater, a shared triumph in the face of a fractured world. Jake sat in the dimly lit room of his apartment, still fuming from the events at the airport. His mind replayed the incident over and over, each detail sharpening the sting of humiliation. He had faced difficult situations before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about missing a flight. It was about being singled out, judged, and discarded in front of a crowd of strangers. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was the airline's customer service. He hesitated before answering, half expecting a hollow apology. "Mr. Daniels, this is Erica from Customer Relations. I want to start by offering our sincere apologies for the way you were treated at the gate. We take these matters very seriously, and I want to assure you that an investigation is already underway." Jake sighed, trying to rein in his frustration. "An investigation doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase how I was treated like a threat for no reason." "I understand," Erica replied softly. "I can't imagine how upsetting this has been for you. But I want you to know we are committed to finding out exactly why this occurred and ensuring it never happens again. We're also offering compensation for the inconvenience and to make up for the way our staff failed you." Jake bit his lip, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Compensation was all well and good, but no amount of money could wipe away the feeling of being seen as dangerous simply because of who he was. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I want accountability. I want to know why she saw me and thought I was a threat. I'm not just some random guy. I'm a police officer. I was flying out to a conference on community relations, for God's sake. How could this happen?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. I understand," Erica finally said, though Jake could sense she didn't fully grasp the depth of his frustration. "We'll be in touch once the investigation concludes. In the meantime, we'll make sure this never happens to you again." Jake hung up, feeling unsatisfied. He wasn't just seeking justice for himself. This was bigger than him. It was about all the people who had been judged unfairly, singled out for no reason other than someone's irrational fear. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, Linda sat in a cramped office across from Monique. The air was thick with tension, and Monique's hands trembled in her lap. She had been dreading this meeting ever since she learned Jake had filed a formal complaint. Linda's gaze was cold and unwavering. "Monique, let me be clear. What you did wasn't just a misstep. It was a serious breach of protocol. You humiliated a customer without any valid reason, and it looks like this wasn't about security at all. It was about your personal bias." Monique swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I thought I saw a security alert. I was just trying to be cautious." Linda's eyebrows shot up. "Cautious? The records show no alert, no reason to even question his ticket. And yet, you decided he was a threat. Why?" Monique's mind scrambled for an answer that wouldn't dig her deeper into trouble. I don't know. He just seemed out of place. There was something about him that made me uneasy." "Out of place?" Linda's voice dropped, icy now. "You mean because he's black? You let your personal feelings override your responsibility. You kicked off a respected police officer attending a conference about bridging community divides because you felt uneasy?" This isn't just about your mistake. It's about the damage you've done, to him, and to this airline. Monique couldn't hold back the tears any longer. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was stressed, overwhelmed. I've been dealing with so much outside of work and I wasn't thinking straight. That's no excuse, Linda snapped. You don't get to project your stress onto innocent people. Do you realize how much damage this has caused? Not just to Mr. Daniels, but to our reputation? This is a PR nightmare. Monique wiped her eyes, but the shame was already etched deep within her. She knew there was no turning back from this mistake. I'm sorry, she whispered. I really am. Sorry doesn't fix this, Linda said quietly. There will be consequences, and you need to be prepared for them. Discrimination, whether intentional or not, has no place in our company. Monique nodded numbly, the weight of her actions sinking in fully for the first time. She had let fear and bias cloud her judgment, and now she would have to face the fallout. Across town, Jake received another call, this time from his manager, Linda. Jake, I've spoken with Monique. It's clear that what happened was unacceptable, and we're taking the necessary steps to address it. I want to personally apologize for the pain this has caused you. Thanks, Linda, Jake replied, though the heaviness in his chest remained. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We're working on that, Linda assured him. This situation won't go ignored. But even as the airline promised to make things right, Jake knew the damage had already been done. The judgmental stares, the public humiliation, it was all etched in his memory. And no investigation or apology could erase the deeper truth, that the world still had a long way to go in seeing people like him for who they truly were, not the stereotypes projected onto them. As he hung up, Jake's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about getting an apology. It was about pushing for change, for accountability, for the kind of world where people weren't seen as threats simply because of their skin color. And he wasn't going to stop until that change became real. Monique's heart raced as Karen's words sank in. She had never expected her path to cross with someone who had such a personal connection to Jake. It was as if fate was pulling her deeper into the web she had unintentionally spun. Jake Harrison? Monique asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Yes. He saved my son's life. If it weren't for him, I don't know what would have happened. Monique swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her guilt press down even harder. Here was another layer to Jake's character, another reason for the world to admire him. And yet, she had been the one to humiliate him in front of so many, to reinforce the very prejudices that had shadowed his life. As Karen continued talking about her son's recovery and Jake's heroism, Monique's mind drifted, torn between shame and a growing desperation to atone for what she had done. But how? Could she even begin to make things right? The investigation had dragged on for weeks. Jake had become a symbol of resilience, his story inspiring countless others to speak up against injustice. Each time Monique turned on the news or scrolled through social media, she saw his face, always calm, always collected. Yet beneath the surface, she wondered how much pain he was truly hiding. She, on the other hand, felt like she was drowning in it. The support group was the first place she'd found that gave her even the smallest sliver of hope, but Karen's story had shaken her. How could she make amends to someone who had become a public figure, a hero to so many? Jake was moving forward, while she seemed to be sinking deeper into her own regret. That night, Monique couldn't sleep. The nightmares had returned, but this time, they weren't just about the incident. They were about Jake, his face filled with disappointment, his eyes full of the pain she had caused. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the confrontation, his quiet dignity clashing with her own rash, thoughtless actions. The next morning, she decided she couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. She needed to face the consequences, not just in the form of the investigation or public outrage, but in a way that might actually mean something. She needed to apologize, not just for the sake of her own redemption, but because it was the right thing to do. Monique spent hours drafting a message to Jake. Every word felt inadequate, every sentence a hollow attempt to convey the depth of her remorse. Finally, after agonizing over it for what seemed like an eternity, she sent a simple, heartfelt message. Jake, I owe you an apology that words alone cannot express. I realize now the harm I've caused, not just to you, but to countless others who face this kind of treatment every day. I hope someday we can talk. I want to listen and learn. I'm deeply sorry. Monique. The days that followed were a torturous wait. Monique wasn't sure if Jake would respond, or if he'd even seen her message. She braced herself for silence, or worse, rejection. But to her surprise, a week later, her phone buzzed with a reply. Monique, I appreciate you reaching out. This isn't easy for either of us, but I believe in change, and I believe people can grow. Let's meet and talk. Her heart leapt into her throat. This was her chance, a step toward redemption, though she knew the road ahead was long and uncertain. Meeting with Jake wouldn't erase the past, but perhaps it could offer a way forward for both of them. As she prepared for their meeting, Monique's thoughts were a whirlwind. She didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't expect to walk away with her guilt lifted, but she hoped that in facing Jake, she could begin to find the courage to rebuild her life and maybe, just maybe, help others do the same. When they finally met in person, the air was thick with tension. Jake's presence was calm, but his eyes held a guarded sadness. Monique could barely meet his gaze as she fumbled for the right words. I'm so sorry, she began, her voice trembling. What I did, it was wrong. I know I can't undo it, but I need to try to make it right. Jake studied her for a moment before speaking. We all make mistakes, he said quietly. What matters is what we do after. That conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected journey, one that would take Monique down a path of self-reflection and activism, not for redemption alone, but to fight the very prejudices she had once been a part of. And as for Jake, while their lives remained on separate trajectories, their encounter was a reminder that the fight for justice was not just his burden to carry, but a shared responsibility. Both would continue to face their own battles, but in that moment, they found a small glimmer of understanding, a recognition that change was not just a possibility, but a necessity. The twists and turns of their lives were far from over, but they were no longer walking alone. Monique's heart pounded as she listened to the woman speak. The name Jake Harrison hit her like a tidal wave, a name she hadn't thought about in months, though its weight haunted her every day. The officer she'd wronged, who she had unfairly judged, was now being hailed a hero. He had saved a young man's life, Eric, the woman's son, showing a bravery she never could have imagined. Monique felt the floor beneath her tilt, the guilt rising like bile in her throat. How could she have been so wrong about him? Days before, she had used Jake as a scapegoat, her anger and frustrations about the system focused on him. She had painted him as a symbol of everything wrong in their town. But now, hearing how he'd sat with Eric, keeping the boy calm until help arrived, made her realize just how deeply she had misunderstood him. Her conscience screamed for resolution. She had to make it right. The next day, Monique reached out to Karen's brother, Eric, knowing he was the key to reaching Jake. Explaining the full extent of her actions was excruciating, but Eric listened, stunned by her confession. Yet, to her relief, he didn't push her away. You need to talk to him, he said softly. Jake's a good guy. He'll listen. With Eric's help, Monique found Jake's contact information. It took her hours to write the email, each word a struggle as she bared her soul. She explained who she was, what she had done, and the deep regret that now consumed her. She pressed send, hoping against hope that Jake would be willing to hear her out. Jake was in the middle of a meeting when he saw her name flash across his screen. His immediate reaction was anger. After all this time, after everything she'd done, now she wanted to talk? But as he read her message, something shifted inside him. Monique's words were raw, filled with remorse. The woman who had judged him so harshly now sought forgiveness. Jake thought back to Eric, how he had clung to his hand, the relief when the paramedics arrived. It reminded him that everyone, no matter their mistakes, deserved a second chance. After a few days of thought, Jake agreed to meet Monique at a quiet cafe. The air between them was thick with tension, but Jake was calm, composed. Monique's hands trembled as she started to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Jake. I let my biases blind me. I was wrong about you, and I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I had to try." Jake sat silently, absorbing her words. He looked at her, seeing the regret etched in her face, and something inside him softened. "Thank you for your apology," he finally said. "What matters now is what we do next. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again, to anyone." Monique felt a wave of relief. There was a chance, however slim, to make things right. And then, unexpectedly, Jake leaned forward, offering her an olive branch. "Join me in my community outreach programs," he said. "Let's show people what prejudice can do and how we can overcome it." She agreed instantly. There was no hesitation, only the fierce need to make amends. Together, they began working side by side, using their story to educate others. They spoke to communities about the dangers of assumptions, about how quick judgments can lead to misunderstandings and harm. As they did, they built a new kind of relationship, one based on respect and a shared desire to bring about change. Months later, as they stood together at a community event, Monique realized just how far they had come. The hostility she once felt toward Jake had been replaced by something deeper: friendship and a shared mission. Their work was making a difference. People were listening. And all because she had admitted her mistake and Jake had given her a second chance. It wasn't just a story about forgiveness. It was about transformation. The pain and conflict had become a catalyst for something far greater. And as they looked out at the diverse crowd before them, united in their commitment to understanding, Monique knew they were changing the world, one person at a time.